Okay, it is time. Okay, so this is where the lights start to blind me and I refocus on the document I've got in front of me here. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Harry Ransom Center, whether you're attending here in person or online, live or at some point in the future. You're here for the 2023 annual Pforzheimer lecture, which showcases bibliographical and book historical research on medieval and early modern cultures. I doubt there has ever been a time when there was more competition for our attention than there is today, and would like to thank you for giving up some of yours to learn about a different attention economy, one from about 400 or so years ago. But I've gotten ahead of myself. I am Aaron T. Pratt, the center's Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts. I do the oldest stuff in our collections, especially the late medieval and early modern European material, the books and manuscripts that are currently on view in my exhibition over there, The Long Lives of Very Old Books. Central to a whole section of that exhibition, the whole thing really, is the basic observation that most of the books that once were no longer are, that the historical record that forms the basis for our understanding of the past is only a fragment. Even printed publications, which were almost always produced in multiples, not infrequently 1,000 or more copies, have vanished, both at the copy level, only a tiny fraction of most print runs survive today, and at the edition level, a significant number of all the editions once printed can't be found in even a single copy. It is possible, however, to follow clues, those within the books themselves and in the form of the scant bits of external business records and other documentation we have, to form inferences about what we've lost. When it comes to the English book trade of the 16th and early 17th centuries, the ones that gave us, say, the plays of William Shakespeare, I can say with complete confidence and only the tiniest desire to flatter that there's no one better at doing this than our speaker tonight, Dr. Alan B. Farmer. I've known Alan for 15 years at this point, since I was a very annoying MA student, and can think of no other person whose approach to the study of bibliography and the history of the book has been more influential when it comes to my own research and my career, or who has been as generous with their knowledge and attention and bar tabs over the years. It is genuinely a real privilege to be able to introduce Alan here and, to extend a decent honorarium to him from the Pforzheimer Endowment. Money talks. Okay. So Alan is Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University and is one of the foremost authorities on the publishing history of early modern English drama and increasingly of the broader English book trade. With each article and book chapter, Alan destabilizes long-held truisms and offers a new, often transformed vision of the media ecosystem in which some of the world's most influential books were published and originally circulated. I could sit here and explain just how important and influential each piece of his writing has been, but that would be appropriate only with a lot more time and probably an associated drinking game. So what I'll do is just mention two pieces, one from the very beginning of Alan's career and one from just the last couple of years. While still a PhD student, Alan and another student, Zachary Lesser, found themselves skeptical about the once standard line that English playbooks, unlike sermons and many other publications, simply weren't that profitable or popular. So they did exactly what they should have done. They did the math, discovering that on at least one measure, the likelihood of a book selling out and going into multiple editions, playbooks fared well. They took on one of the titans of the field and were prompted to defend their article from his published critique in the pages of Shakespeare Quarterly, one of the field's flagship journals, as graduate students. Collaborative work that Alan and Zach have published since then has only expanded our sense of how vital playbooks appear to have been to early readers and the broader book trade. More recently, Alan's solo chapter on widow publishers in London, 1540 to 1640, has offered us a taxonomy by which to understand publishers, conservative versus entrepreneurial publishers, and revealed that there was a network of widow publishers and printers who regularly collaborated with each other in the 1630s. It's an incredibly important intervention that contributes to our growing awareness of the very active role that women played in the early modern book trade. Oh, and Alan is currently at work on a book that the whole field has been eagerly awaiting, Plays, Print, and Popularity in Shakespeare's England. And with a plea for him to finish the damn thing, I introduce you to Dr. Alan B. Farmer, who will be talking to us about lost books, the dark matter of the early modern book trade.
Thank you, Aaron, for that delightful introduction. And I should say, too, that Aaron is one of my favorite people in the field. There's as you may have realized, there's no one quite like him. And so thank you, Aaron, for bringing me here. And thank you to Cheryl McGrath for arranging my trip, and to the entire Ransom team for making this such a wonderful experience, and to all of you for coming out here on a Thursday afternoon. So I want to begin my talk today, Lost Books, the Dark Matter of the Early Modern English Book Trade, with an example of what not to do when talking about lost books. I'm going to give you a couple of memorable statistics, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my time telling you why I think it is a mistake to make those striking numbers central to our understanding of lost books and the early modern English book trade. I know, I'm setting you up to remember exactly the wrong thing. But by including this overdetermined preamble, I'm hoping that your curiosity about why I insist these figures are misleading will ultimately win out over what makes these two statistics so memorable. I'm counting on, in other words, that you will walk away from this talk with a better understanding of how we count and what we count are nuanced determinations, and that properly attending to granular details is even more important in quantitative work than it often is in qualitative studies. The big question that book historians and bibliographers have about lost books is this: how many lost books are there? Or, put differently, how many books printed in the Renaissance have subsequently become lost in the past several hundred years? Here's one answer. From 1557, the year the Stationers' Company was officially established in London, through 1640, the last full year before the collapse of the licensing system that regulated printing in the run-up to the English Civil War, about 99% of the books printed for the English book trade are now lost. Some of the books that survive are unique copies, the only ones to survive of a particular work. In other cases, there can be hundreds of copies of a work, like the Shakespeare First Folio, for which there are now currently 228 known copies out of the several hundred that were originally printed. By considering the English book trade this way, as a whole economy of circulating commodities, it is possible to estimate that from 1557, there we go, to 1640, there were probably over 400 million individual books printed, and less than 500,000 are now extant. That works out to a loss rate of about 99%. Okay, that's the first memorable statistic. At this point, you might reasonably point out that printed books were intended to be produced in hundreds or thousands of copies of the same work. The word copy begins to capture this semantic nuance, as the Oxford English Dictionary indicates, one of the various written or printed specimens of the same writing or work, an individual example of a manuscript or print. The technical term for all the copies printed from the same setting of type is an edition. And one of the most important consequences of Gutenberg's invention of movable type in the printing press was the power of duplication, the power to print works in addition. For while manuscript scribes could produce only a single copy at a time, printers could print hundreds or even thousands of copies of a text from a single setting of type. Every copy of an edition may not have been identical to every other copy due to various forms of correction that could occur during the printing of an edition. And obviously, each copy was its own discrete ontological entity with its own sheets of paper, its own ink, its own form of binding. But the printing of editions meant that exponentially more copies were being produced in the Renaissance than had ever been the case before Gutenberg's invention. And it is the edition that often most interests bibliographers. For even if only a single copy from an edition survives, it is possible to make reasonable assumptions about other lost copies that do not. So to revise my earlier question, to better align with the interests of book historians, how many editions printed in the Renaissance are now lost? It is these lost editions that have been called, in the words of the German incunabulist Falk Eisermann, the dark matter of the Gutenberg galaxy, a phrase he uses to refer to entire editions which are known to have existed but have vanished altogether. The reason Eiserman refers to lost editions as dark matter is that scholars often know such editions did or must have existed, but they cannot know just how many such editions there were. But in addition to editions that are known to have existed, there are others that are not known to have existed because there are no historical references to them. Such unknown lost editions can only be inferred. And here again, a real difficulty faced by book historians is determining how many of these lost editions there may have been. It is possible, though, to make reasonable projections, and this is going to be my second memorable statistic. From 1557 to 1640, almost half, as in 49%, of the editions printed for the English book trade are probably now lost. There are somewhere around close to 25,000 extant editions in this period, and there may be around another 23,500 lost editions. What that means is that for every early modern edition we now have, there is perhaps another that is now lost. The number of lost editions would seem to be historically significant, for it suggests that our sense of the English Renaissance may be based on only half the editions that were printed. So to repeat, 99% of copies and 49% of editions, or over 400 million lost copies and close to 24,000 lost editions. Those are the headline-grabbing figures of my talk. They're the ones I would highlight if I wanted to make my claims about how lost books will change everything you thought you knew about the Renaissance English book trade. And before I continue, let me stress that these estimates of lost copies and lost editions are not at all inflated. Though estimates, they are grounded in several forms of bibliographical evidence, which I'll return to in a bit. Even if I wanted to be more conservative, these estimates would not change much. So, perhaps we'll say only 98 to 90% of the copies are lost, or only 47 to 49% of editions are now lost. But these are not the figures I want you to remember. Not because they are wrong, but because I think they create a misleading impression of the prevalence and significance of lost editions, and thus a misleading impression of the economics of the book trade, and ultimately misleading impressions of the intellectual, religious, literary, scientific, political, and educational histories of the Renaissance. Why misleading? Because they are under-contextualized. Both of these statistics treat the book trade as an undifferentiated whole, with all copies and all editions treated the same. It suggests that every edition had a 50-50 chance of becoming lost, and that every printed copy had a 99% chance of not surviving. But neither of those inferences would be correct. Instead, certain kinds of publications were more likely to become lost. Some were much more likely, both because of their content and because of their bibliographical features, points to which I will return in a moment. In the rest of my talk today, I therefore want to re-examine the statistics with which I have begun and offer in their place a more nuanced account of the different kinds of publications that seem to have become lost. In doing so, I will necessarily consider the admittedly important question of how many lost editions are there, but mainly as a way of beginning to think about the larger historical, economic, and cultural significance of lost editions. To me, the more pressing questions are, how can lost editions change our understanding of the early modern book trade? And how might lost editions reshape historical and cultural narratives that intersect with the early modern book trade? I will end with a few additional, and I hope interesting accounts of how lost editions open up new ways of understanding early modern printers, booksellers, and readers, and of what lost editions illustrate about early modern religious history and early modern literary history. Before attempting to answer those larger questions, though, I think it would help to provide an overview of some of the methods and methodological challenges that come with studying lost books. Basically, every time I tell family members what I'm doing, their immediate thing is like, well, how do you do that if they don't exist? This next section is like, how do you find out about lost books? Okay, so how to find lost editions. Determining whether an edition has been lost is necessarily an act of critical judgment. To state the obvious, if no copies now exist of an edition, scholars can only infer whether such an edition existed in the past. When considering the book trade as a whole, it is only possible to construct estimates of how many editions are likely to have become lost. Doing so requires scholars to sift through documentary evidence and organize larger collections of bibliographical data to come up with plausible conjectures about books and editions that no longer exist. There are 4 methods that scholars tend to use to carry out this research, all of which have their own advantages and limitations. One of the most straightforward methods is to compare references to early modern editions against those books that survive. These references might involve allusions to editions made by early modern authors, or they could include manuscript copies made from printed editions. But perhaps the most informative come from book lists produced by early modern printers, booksellers, readers, and librarians. For instance, a reference to a 1612 edition of Ben Jonson's Epigrams, an edition that doesn't exist anymore, was recently discovered by Tara Lyons in the archives of the Bodleian Library. Other book historians have compared surviving editions to those listed in printed catalogs of books, such as the bookseller Andrew Monzell's 1595 catalog. Oh, gosh, delay. There we go. Anyway, other book historians have compared surviving editions to those listed in printed catalogs of books, such as the bookseller Andrew Monzell's 1595 Catalog of English Printed Books, and to the editions advertised in book lists put out by printers, such as William Jaggard's 1618 Catalog of Such English Books as Lately Have Been and Now Are in Printing for Publication, or John Bill's catalogs that he brought out in the early 1620s that advertised recently published English language books, which incidentally is where Shakespeare's first folio was first advertised, which Aaron Pratt can tell you more about. While such catalogs are an invaluable source of information on specific editions, they do have their limitations. Most important, they were never intended to list all the editions printed in every genre during a specific time period. They were curated lists and selective advertisements, and as a result, most of the editions printed for the English book trade do not appear in them. Even Conrad Gesner's 1545 Bibliotheca Universalis, which was intended to list all known books, did not include all known printed editions of every kind of work. It sometimes happens, moreover, that book lists contain errors, especially those drawn up by later readers and collectors, which can have incorrect imprint dates, mistranscribed titles, or erroneous author attributions. These kinds of errors can lead to ghost editions that are sometimes believed to be lost, but in reality never existed. A related form of evidence useful for detecting lost editions is one that is peculiar to the English book trade starting in 1557, the stationers' registers. In theory, when printers or booksellers who were members of the stationers' company wished to print a work for the first time, they were supposed to obtain a license from the company, allowing them to do so. The main purpose of this company license was to establish a stationer's exclusive right to publish that work. And that license would often, but not always, be written down or entered in the stationers' registers. This is a streamlined version of how this process worked. I'm not getting into all the nitty-gritty details, but that's generally how it was supposed to work. For example, one of the earliest licenses recorded in the stationers' registers is from the summer of 1557, when Thomas Marsh entered this book called The Rules and Right Ample Documents Touching the Use and Practice of the Common Almanac, which is called Ephemerides. Later that year or the next, Marsh printed that work in an undated edition, which still exists. The very next work to be licensed and entered, though, did not fare as well. William Griffith entered an almanac and prognostication of George Williams's doing, but there is no known edition either of this almanac or indeed of any work written by George Williams. As with book lists, entries in the stationers' registers provide valuable information about what London printers and booksellers either published or intended to publish. They tell us about what works existed prior to their being printed. One of the most important details to understand about the stationers' register, though, is that not every work entered in them always resulted in a printed edition. It is very likely that Griffith did print an edition of Williams's almanac in late 1557. But that was not true of every work that appears in the registers. A register entry functioned much like modern studio film producing, and sometimes stationers decided against publishing a work because they no longer believed it would sell well, just as today a film will sometimes stall in development. In other cases, stationers planned to publish a translation and duly obtained a license from the company, but it seems the translator never finished the translation. In still other cases, the company issued a license on the condition that the stationer entering a title obtain what was called further allowance from an ecclesiastical licenser. Again, in theory, every work was supposed to have an ecclesiastical license before it could be printed, the purpose of which was to determine whether the work contained any dangerous matter, such as incendiary political or religious ideas and arguments. Stationers, though, did not always seek out an ecclesiastical license for every work they brought out, which is why the stationers' company occasionally refused to grant a company license until a stationer had obtained further allowance. Finally, there was no way to determine if an entry in the stationers' registers is matched by a corresponding extant edition, other than doing the laborious work of matching entries and editions oneself. Stationers' register entries are not comprehensively and accurately listed in other resources like the English Short Title Catalog, as one young scholar has recently assumed, and so an added challenge in working with titles that appear in the stationers' register is figuring out whether those entries are or are not for an extant edition. Side note, I have been doing that laborious work. That's what this talk comes out of. So the publication book will probably take a backseat to that. All right. A more intractable problem with entries in the stationers' register concerns works that do have extant editions. Simply because one edition exists of a work does not automatically mean that there were not also other editions that have become lost. In order to deal with this problem, lost editions of extant works, book historians have had to come up with other methods for estimating the prevalence of lost editions. These other models can involve somewhat advanced statistical models. Some models are based on negative binomial distributions, which are predicated on the assumption that the survival of copies in an edition are correlated rather than independent. So basically, if I throw out my copy of Hamlet, then that means you were probably more likely to throw out your copy of Hamlet. And the incunabulists Jonathan Green and Frank McIntyre have done most of the work using this kind of modeling. In contrast, other scholars contend that whether a copy of an edition becomes lost is a random, independent event. My tossing out my copy of Hamlet does not mean that you are likely also to throw out your copy of Hamlet. This contention has led scholars, namely Jorn Prout and Leo Ege, to develop stochastic models for estimating the prevalence of lost editions. Don't worry, I'm not about to launch into an extended discussion of statistical models. But what unites these various approaches is their attempt to calculate the likely number of editions with zero surviving copies, i.e. lost editions, from the number of copies surviving with one copy, surviving in 2 copies, surviving in 3 copies, etc. Colloquially known as zero graphing, this method is especially useful because it can be used to calculate the number of lost editions either of a relatively small group of books, how many lost editions of playbooks from the 1590s England might there be, or of a large population of books, such as all the editions of Incunabula printed in Europe in the 15th century. Beyond the contentious debate over whether the survival of copies is correlated or independent. Zerographing as a method depends on two types of foundational bibliographical evidence: reliable data on extant editions and reliable data on the number of copies for each edition. Without reliable data on editions or copies, the calculations produced by zerographing can rapidly diminish. Perhaps not surprisingly, bibliographers studying incunabula, books printed in 15th century Europe, have been at the forefront of using zerographing techniques. As is the case with the plays of Shakespeare's England, incunabulae have been assiduously described and collected for centuries. The detailed attention of bibliographers to books printed in this period has allowed them to determine how many extant editions survive, and after the creation of the online database, Incunabula's short title catalog, that research has been extended to listing all the known copies of those editions. Books printed in later periods, however, have not yet benefited from similar levels of bibliographical research. For books printed in England, the editors of a short title catalog of books printed in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and of English books printed abroad, known as the STC, the editors of which were A.W. Pollard, G.R. Redgrave, William A. Jackson, F.S. Ferguson, and Catherine Panzer, which I mention only out of extreme admiration, and I use this book so much. They established a high standard for distinguishing different editions of the same work from variant issues of those editions. The STC attempts to catalog all printed English documents from 1475 to 1640, but it is not a comprehensive census. It does not list all known copies of each edition, nor does its own line derivative, the English Short Title Catalog, or ESTC, offer comprehensive and accurate censuses of known copies for every edition. The STC does list some copies, sometimes quite a lot, but not all of them. And this means it cannot be used for creating accurate calculations at the scale needed for zerographing of the book trade as a whole. Books printed in other regions of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, moreover, as reported in the Universal Short Title Catalog, which is another online database, have not yet received the same kind of bibliographical attention that matches the rigor and accuracy of the STC. Generating zerograph estimates based on the records found in the ESTC, or the USTC, therefore, is a hazardous exercise. While these limitations do not mean the estimates produced by zerographing are irrevocably flawed, they do mean that estimates derived from zerographing of unedited data should be treated with a significant degree of caution. The final method for estimating lost editions is one that so far only I have used. I feel like this is my method. Not that others couldn't use it. And that's numbered editions. For an essay of mine published in 2016, I looked for every STC edition with an edition statement on its title page, such as the second edition, the third edition, etc. At first, I thought these editions statements might have been artificially inflated by publishers to make works seem more popular than they perhaps were. But when it became clear that such statements are usually correct, I realized it was possible to use edition statements to identify probable lost editions of specific works. Building on that initial data, I then constructed estimates of lost editions across the entire English book trade from 1580 to 1640. One of the benefits of using numbered editions is that the surviving editions provide crucial bibliographical evidence for what is probably true of lost editions. For instance, if are all quartos with 20 leaves, then it is probably the case that the missing third and fourth editions were also quartos with 20 leaves. This claim is necessarily an inference, but it is one well-grounded in other evidence from the English book trade, in which reprint editions tend to closely follow and thus be very similar to preceding editions of the same work. Despite this advantage, numbered editions do come with several drawbacks. First, edition statements only began to appear on title pages with sufficient regularity in the English book trade after 1580. And since it is more likely that editions printed before 1580 have higher loss rates than those printed at the end of the 16th century and in the early 17th century, Numbered editions cannot really be used to make claims about the book trade prior to that year, before 1580. In addition, although edition statements appear on a wide variety of books in different genres, they were almost never used on one important kind of publication: single-leaf editions, like ballads and religious tables. These publications were printed on just a single full broadsheet leaf, or a single half broadsheet leaf, or even a smaller single leaf. And I therefore had to exclude single-leaf publications from my 2016 estimates. Since publishing that essay, I've resumed working on lost editions. Totally a pandemic project. I was at home with a 3-year-old and then who turned 4, and I could only work in short bursts, and I began looking in the stationer's registers because I could do it in piecemeal work, and that's what this larger project emerges out of. I still think it prudent to avoid using zero graphing because I'm not convinced that there are sufficiently accurate figures for copies of extant editions of English books printed in this period. Instead, I have chosen to focus on entries in the stationer's registers for what they can tell us about editions that are now lost, as well as entire works that are now lost. What follows are some of the results of that research that I find both important and interesting. So, what kind of editions are most likely to become lost? Let's begin by revisiting the 49% statistic that I suggested that you focus on, that you not focus on or remember. As I mentioned, the reason I consider this figure to be misleading is that it smooshes together all the editions printed for the English book trade without considering which specific kinds of publications are more likely to be lost or what bibliographical features seem to have contributed to editions becoming lost. These two criteria have often bedeviled other scholars of lost books, over and beyond the challenge of estimating the total number of lost editions. In their multiple studies of incunabuli, for example, Green and McIntyre have sought to link lost editions to individual printers, to the number of leaves in an edition, to the format of editions, which has produced varying estimates of loss rates that range from 31% up to 62%. What my study of numbered editions showed is that the overall loss rate across the entire English book trade from 1580 to 1640 was around 23%. And I'll talk about why that's so much lower than the 49% figure I began with in a moment. What my follow-up analysis of entries in the stationer's register has confirmed is that the two most important factors contributing to lost editions are the number of sheets in an edition and its genre, or if you will, size and genre are what matter most. That's the nuanced point I really want you to remember. Yeah. All right, so what do I mean by size? Well, every scholar of lost books has recognized that bibliographical size is important. They have not typically agreed on how to measure an edition's physical size. Most have tended to think of it either as a synonym for a book's format or for the number of leaves it has. And it turns out neither format nor leaves is as important as edition sheets, at least for editions printed for the English book trade from 1557 to 1640. The term edition sheets refers to the number of sheets of paper that are in a single copy of an edition. Those sheets may have been folded once, which would have resulted in tall folios with 2 leaves per sheet. Or those sheets may have been folded twice, producing more square quartos with 4 leaves per sheet. Or they could have been folded 3 times to produce a smaller octavo. Or they could have been folded additional times to produce smaller formats like duodecimos, 16 mos, 32 mos, or even teeny tiny 64 mos and 128 mos. The key point is this: editions with the same number of sheets. Oh my goodness. There we go. Editions with the same number of sheets tend to have similar loss rates compared to editions in the same format, but with different numbers of leaves. For instance, a quarto with 40 leaves has 10 edition sheets, and quartos with 10 edition sheets tend to have a loss rate that is much closer to that of octavos with 10 edition sheets, duodecimos with 10 edition sheets, etc., than to quartos with 5 or 20 sheets. Most important, Editions with fewer sheets have higher loss rates than editions of larger volumes with more sheets. That's kind of what you'd expect. Like I said, size matters. Based on the evidence of numbered editions, 2-sheet pamphlets have loss rates of up to 60%, whereas publications of 9 sheets usually have a much lower rate, around 10%, while those of 50 sheets or more have even lower loss rates, under 1%. My other key finding is that genre matters too. Even for editions with the same number of sheets, certain genres have higher loss rates than other books of the same size do. The genres that have consistently higher loss rates are devotional prayer books, catechisms, school books that teach grammar and reading, handwriting manuals, works of moral philosophy aimed at children, true, and needlework and lace patterns. And there's a 7th genre, which I'll talk about at the end of my talk. What these genres all share is that they were books intended to be used and not merely read. 4 of them were often used for the education of children: catechisms, grammar and reading school books, handwriting manuals, and moral philosophy for children. Books of needlework and lace patterns, meanwhile, were meant to be used for sewing, not for reading at all, while prayer books and catechisms were types of religious publications that appear to have prioritized use over reading. To repeat these key points, when we think about size and genre together, we find that in general, smaller publications with fewer edition sheets tended to have much higher loss rates. These kinds of books were often news pamphlets, almanacs, books of poetry, catechisms, and short religious treatises, sometimes known as penny godlies. And across editions of all sizes, genres that tended to be used more heavily rather than merely read also had higher loss rates, sometimes much higher. But there's another factor that seems to have mattered. Jorn Prout, in his research on the Flemish book trade, has independently concluded that edition sheets appear to be a key factor in loss rates in that segment of the European book trade. But he's also found that if a publication was bound in what is known as a Sammelband, the odds of that copy, and thus that edition, becoming lost were lower. What is a Sammelband? Sammelbands are volumes that bring together separately published items into a single bound copy. They were typically created by readers rather than booksellers, and so they often reflect a reader's idiosyncratic interests. The works in a Sammelband might all be by the same author or all works in the same genre, but they did not have to be. They could be a hodgepodge of unrelated items in a variety of genres that a reader decided, for some reason, to bind together. As the Ransom Center's own Aaron Pratt has suggested, sometimes Sammelbands were just simply a good way of storing the books you owned, especially if the individual items were about the same height and length. It would be incredibly difficult to confirm Prout's theory for the English book trade because so many English books that were once bound in a Sammelband have been disbound and rebound separately, as Jeffrey Todd Knight has shown. But Prout's theory sounds like it is probably true. When a reader created a Sammelband, that act demonstrated she intended to hold on to those publications and not get rid of them. A Sammelband, then, is an investment in preservation, an explicit desire to protect books from loss. There's an additional point I'd like to make about how lost editions affect our sense of the early modern English book trade. One of the temptations held out by lost books and lost editions is the possibility that they have become lost because there is something special or unusual about their content. This mindset can easily shade into fantasies of secret or dangerous knowledge that had to be suppressed. This way of thinking is understandable. Lost editions do encourage thinking about alternate histories that would be possible if those editions survived. Let me give an example. Perhaps, for me, the most tantalizing lost edition I have found is a poetry book entered by Eleazar Edgar in January 1600, a book called Amours by J.D., with certain other sonnets by W.S. Could this work have been a lost collection of love poetry by John Donne and William Shakespeare printed together in the same volume? It is fun to wonder how the survival of this edition might change our sense of the literary history and the narratives we tell about the careers of these two canonical authors. Or does J.D. merely refer to another poet, Sir John Davies, who's not nearly as exciting? No offense. Lost editions are brimming with these kinds of what-if scenarios, which is part of what makes working on them so fun. And yet when lost editions are looked at all together, it turns out they must always look like pretty much the other editions that do survive. Many lost editions are works that survive in other printings. Others are translations of works that exist in other languages. Some are news pamphlets on events that are described in other contemporaneous records. Recovering lost editions would certainly enrich our knowledge of the early modern period, but it is unlikely that they would radically change it because of exciting or dangerous material we imagine they might contain. All right, next section, the retail book trade and the business of printing. Although I think it is important to understand that lost editions probably look a lot like surviving editions, that does not mean lost editions do not have some significant implications for our understanding of the English book trade. As I mentioned earlier, almost no single-leaf publications include an edition statement, which is why I excluded them from my 2016 estimates. The stationer's registers, however, provide vital evidence about the printing of ballads and religious tables. And religious tables, it's just a word that was used for like single sheet broadsheets that often had some sort of like more of religious instruction on them, or the Ten Commandments, is often meant for hanging on walls. And the stationer's registers also give us some better ideas about how loss rates changed over time. Again, the registers are less useful for determining how many editions of a work may have become lost, nor can they tell us how many edition sheets a lost work with no surviving editions may have had. Nor do works entered in the stationer's registers represent all the editions that were printed in a given period. Only about 1/3 of the extant titles in the early years of the stationer's registers were entered, though by the 1630s that figure may have been up to 70% of works. All right, with those caveats out of the way, there are about 11,500 titles that were entered in the registers from 1557 to 1640. Of those, about 2,500 entries were for single-leaf ballads or religious tables, while about 9,000 were for titles that are likely to have been pamphlets or books. The loss rate for these two types of publication are starkly different. Pamphlets and books have a loss rate of 15.5%, whereas single-leaf ballads and religious tables have a loss rate of 78%. These loss rates, furthermore, declined over time. Entered titles of pamphlets and books have a loss rate of 25% from 1557 to 1579, which went down to 18% and then dipped further to 12% by the 17th century. Even the loss rates of ballads show a small decline, going from 83% and 86% up through 1603, and then declining to 69% thereafter. And the reason for this drop in loss rates over time is that both kinds of publication probably benefited due to the collecting habits of later readers in the 17th century. All right, now I want to complicate the loss rates I've just given you a bit further. Among those entered titles that have extant editions, there are some that have a gap of several years between when they were entered and when the first extant edition dates from. And so the key idea here is that most editions, when they were entered, you get an extant edition within a year or two, usually the same year, sometimes a year afterwards, when you have a gap of like 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 years. That suggests there may be an intervening lost edition or editions that were printed then. What happens to loss rates if we include titles that may have a lost edition? When titles of books and pamphlets with possibly lost editions are added to those titles with no surviving editions, the resulting loss rate is 21%, which is very close to the 23% I came up with based on numbered editions. We also see similar declines in loss rates over time, with pamphlets and books entered from 1557 to 1559 having a loss rate of 38%, but those entered afterwards going down to 19%, while the corresponding figures for ballads are 89 and 85%. In addition, it's worth noting that the loss rates for specific genres, such as religious treatises or sermons or medical books or travel books, are almost always in line with what numbered editions suggest too. The genres with the highest loss rates according to numbered editions are the same genres with the highest loss rates based on entries in the Stationer's Register. All right. The difference in loss rates for pamphlets and books compared to ballads and tables reveals several important points about the early modern English book trade that would otherwise be partially or entirely obscured. First, single-leaf publications were a much bigger segment of the retail book trade than extant editions alone would suggest. Among editions that survive, only 5% are single-leaf publications. But when lost editions are factored in, then it is likely that they represented around 35% of the editions available to sale for readers. Not only are single-leaf editions the most ephemeral of early modern publications, they also seem to have been printed in more editions than any other genre of work. The very centrality of short publications to the retail book trade becomes even more apparent when lost editions of book and pamphlets are considered. Over 50% of all publications sold in the retail book trade would have been 4 edition sheets or less. And the idea here is, as a point of comparison, playbooks are often more than twice that length, usually 9 sheets. These 4 sheets, we're talking very short books and pamphlets. The reason is that these short editions are, like ballads and tables, overrepresented among lost editions. The impact of these short editions the impact of short publications that are now lost can be seen in these 2 graphs. This first one shows that even among extant editions, these are books that survive, short publications were at the heart of the retail book trade, with publications of 10 sheets or less composing over half the surviving editions. But when lost ballads and other single-leaf publications are combined with other genres of lost editions, the increase in the very shortest publications is striking. Over half the editions printed would have been under 4 edition sheets, maybe even 3 edition sheets. And if you can't tell, the y-axis went from like 8,000 up to 30,000. That's a huge increase. The red is including lost editions. The black are the ones that still survive. Counting editions, however, is only one way to compute the size of the English book trade. Editions are particularly relevant when thinking about booksellers in the business of selling books. And very short publications were clearly central to that part of the trade. But printing short editions would have been less essential for early modern printers. The business of printing was centered on producing printed sheets, and it did not really matter to printers whether those sheets were for single-leaf ballads, small pamphlets, or weighty tomes like the Shakespeare First Folio. As Peter Stallybrass has memorably put it, printers do not print books. They print sheets. What mattered for printers was the production of printed sheets, not the ultimate destination of those sheets, whether they were for ballads or huge folios. So how do lost editions change our view of the business of printing? Although very short publications of 4 sheets or less probably accounted for over 50% of editions for sale in bookshops, those editions would have represented only about 7% of the edition sheets produced by printers in the English book trade. What this means is that most of the sheets produced by printers, and therefore most of where their revenue would have come from, would have been for bigger books with more edition sheets, in particular long editions with more than 50 sheets. Lost editions therefore help reveal a fundamental division in the economics of the English book trade between, on the one hand, the business of printing, in which big books were most important, and on the other hand, the business of bookselling, in which retailing ballads, religious tables, and small pamphlets to customers was central. And I should also note that Stallybrass's essay is mainly focused on yet another form of printing called job printing, which involved producing things like alehouse licenses and apprentice indentures, proclamations, publications that were not meant for retail sale in bookshops. And everything I'm talking about is about the retail book trade, things that you would want to buy. But even if you include job printing, again, the number of sheets involved were so small that it still leaves the fact that printers were mainly making most of their money from printing big books. All right. Final section, readers, religious history, or religious books and literary history. I want to end with a couple of examples of how lost editions can inform and reshape our understanding of how books were read. The first example concerns religious publications. Book historians have suggested two main causes for an edition becoming lost. The first is neglect. The idea is, readers did not care about some kinds of publications enough to want to keep them. These may have been the kinds of publications that were not worth including in a Sammelband. The other reason is the inverse, that readers engaged with some books so intensively that copies were read or used to death. This fate seems to lie behind the increased loss rates of the heavy use genres I discussed earlier. What I find interesting is what lost editions suggest about how different kinds of religious publications were used by readers. It is not surprising that editions of early modern Bibles are unlikely to have become lost. These were typically big books of over 100 edition sheets that could be passed down in families over several generations. But what is perhaps surprising is that devotional prayer books and catechisms are the only genres of religious publications that seems to have been read or used in ways that led to especially high loss rates. Religious treatises, which after ballads were the most frequently printed genre in the book trade, were not typically read to death, nor were sermons, biblical study aids, New Testaments, or even books of common prayer. These other genres of religious publications appear to have been more read than heavily used, whereas devotional prayer books and catechisms seem to have been more used than simply read. Or they were read so heavily that a significant number of editions have become lost. Not all religious publications were apparently used in quite the same ways. And what is true of religious books is also true of editions of literature. For me, the most unexpected genre among those with the highest loss rates is one that I avoided mentioning earlier. It is not a genre of publication that would have been used in any obvious way. Instead, it is one that seems to have higher lost editions because copies were read to death. If I were giving this talk 10 years ago, you would now perhaps be expecting me to say that this other high loss genre was printed drama. It's not. But the reason you would have had that expectation is that for a long time, the conventional wisdom about printed plays, especially those that had been performed in the professional London theaters starting in the late 16th century, held that they were subliterary riffraffs, in the words of Thomas Bodley, founder of the Oxford University Bodleian Library. Adding to the impression that playbooks were ephemeral is the fact that most of the plays performed in London no longer survive. Why? Because less than 1% of the manuscript playbooks used by professional playing companies survives, something like 19 manuscript copies out of over 3,000 plays. It therefore makes a certain kind of sense that scholars would expect printed plays to have high loss rates too, but they don't. Publications of 9 edition sheets typically have loss rates of around 10%, and the loss rate for playbooks is probably lower. Closer to 5%. Part of the reason for their lower loss rate is surely due to the desire to preserve these books by later collectors, but early modern readers also appear to have frequently bound playbooks together in Sammelbands, which would have been relatively straightforward considering that most plays were published in quarto editions of about the same length. So although manuscript playbooks have a loss rate of over 99%, the loss rate for printed playbooks is around 5%, making them, in fact, among the least ephemeral forms of literature published in early modern England. The claims scholars used to make about playbooks, and occasionally still do, are, it turns out, more true of works of prose fiction. Romances, proto-novels, collections of tales and jests, were undeniably popular with readers in the early modern period. For instance, they were reprinted about twice as often as books in other genres. And the same is true of playbooks. Unlike playbooks, though, numbered editions of works of prose fiction have a loss rate roughly 4 times higher than you would expect for books of the same size. In 2016, I projected that they had a loss rate of around 39%, an estimate that closely matches what entries in the Stationer's Register show, a loss rate of around 35%. While this high loss rate could be taken to mean that works of prose fiction were not valued very highly by readers, the neglect hypothesis, I think the opposite is more likely. Readers seem to have enjoyed reading prose fiction too much, leading to their copies being read to death. If that is right, then how we think about the cultural value of early modern drama and early modern prose fiction needs to be tweaked. Prose fiction from the English Renaissance is now seen as having much less cultural value and academic interest compared to early modern drama. But in the Renaissance, the opposite may have been true. Readers may have enjoyed prose fiction so much that they often read their copies to destruction, much the way modern paperbacks can withstand only so many readings. This is my wife's copy of her high school Cider House Rules, which she has read until it's fallen apart. An outcome that seems to have happened much less often with printed playbooks. Playbooks were undeniably one of the most popular genres in the early modern English book trade, but they do not appear to have been consumed quite as intensely as books of prose fiction were. Okay, short conclusion. To return one final time to the statistics I gave at the beginning of my talk, that up to 98 or 99% of printed copies are now lost, and up to 49% of the editions printed from 1557 to 1640 are possibly lost. Although interesting, and I think accurate estimates of lost copies and lost editions, these figures nonetheless obscure more important and more informative, more interesting stories about what caused editions to become lost, as well as the economic and historical significance of lost editions. By looking more closely at the particularities of lost editions in the early modern English book trade, we can gain a better understanding of the business of selling books and the business of printing, and we can gain new insights into the culture of religious reading and new ways of thinking about the literary history of early modern England. Thank you.
Right in the middle. All right. Whoa. Sorry, guys. We've run a little bit long, but I wanted to make sure we got a couple of questions in before we adjourn to our reception. So I've got some from the YouTube in my pocket here, but I'd like to hear some from somebody in the audience right now. What do you got? There's an audience mic, so we should be able to capture it for the online feed. Yeah, right in the back.
So what factors contribute to the conclusion or the statement that prose fiction was more popular than we might think in the early modern period? And what are some, and forgive my ignorance, what are some examples of prose fiction?
Okay, that's an excellent question. So in thinking about the popularity of prose fiction in the Renaissance, it's the two clearest indications are first that in the book trade as a whole, when a work was newly printed for the first time, it was an uncertain economic venture. Publishers couldn't know how well that book would sell or not. And then if it sold well and they perceived that there was enough continued interest in another edition of the work, that would cause a work to be reprinted. And so reprinting is evidence that a previous edition had sold out and that a publisher perceived enough continued interest in a work to warrant its being printed again. And the key thing is, overall, only about 20% of first editions ended up getting reprinted. Whereas among works of prose fiction, that reprint rate is 35%. And you might say 35% versus 20%, is that a lot? It's a lot. That makes prose fiction one of the genres with the highest reprint rate across the entire English book trade. And then you add to that the fact that unlike other books with high loss rates, which clearly were meant to be used in a particular way, there's no obvious way that readers would have been using, a romance or using a book like Lily's Euphues, which is an incredibly popular work of prose fiction. And so those two factors are what lead me to think that prose fiction actually was kind of way more popular than we now realize. And in our account of early modern drama, like basically when I'm working with students and graduate students, undeniably, like Renaissance drama is at the top because there's Shakespeare and other famous dramatists. Then Renaissance poetry is what most other scholars tend to be interested in. And then you have prose fiction, which is kind of a niche interest that doesn't have the same appeal. And so it's partly about the disjunction between the way that we now think about prose fiction versus the interest that readers in the period seem to have. And so most of these works of prose fiction are, or often they're these prose romances that were translations of editions that had been printed on the continent in other languages. But you also have some native ones like Lily's Euphues. Thomas Deloney wrote a couple of works of prose fiction, my favorite being Jack of Newbury. And then Robert Greene was another author who wrote several works of very popular prose fiction, one of which was a kind of proto-novel called Pandosto, which furnished the basic plot elements for William Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. So basically, Greene, Deloney, Lilly, you're looking at some of the greatest hits of Renaissance English prose fiction, and those are in no way like the authors that we tend to want to study or work on when we're thinking about the English Renaissance literature.
Yeah, right in the middle there.
Quick question on the map. So you said there's approximately 50,000 editions, estimated 50,000 editions that were printed during this period. And there's about 500 million copies. So that would be 10,000 copies per edition. Sounds high.
No, it was about 50,000 copies, about 400 million editions. Should it be 40 million? Did I?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. So the normal.
What is, do you think, the
Yeah.
average number?
Yeah. The number that's. Yeah.
I don't think it's 10,000.
No, it's 1,000. So that was a math error. Yeah. So.
There must have been a high range, right? If there were, even if 1,000's the average, if there were many probably that were only printed in the dozens of hundreds, there must have been some editions that had very large runs.
This is what's interesting. So one of the regulations of the Stationers Company was that they didn't want too many copies being printed from the same setting of type. And so the company regulation set a maximum of 1,500 copies per edition that later got raised to 2,000 copies for some genres in the late 1630s. And so one of the things that's true is that because there was a cap on the maximum number of copies that were supposed to be printed, and because most of the printing that was done for retail sale wouldn't have been sort of editions that were privately printed where you might only print a dozen or so copies, then that means that even though you're right, there would be a range in the number of editions, the range wouldn't have been so huge that you can't sort of plausibly say that, roughly 1,000 copies is a realistic estimate of the number of copies that would have been printed in an edition.
The major exception is that with some of these patented books, so that
Right.
certain publication genres, particularly like psalters, almanacs, ABCs, catechisms, they were controlled by sort of higher level jurisdictions, and they didn't have the same caps on print runs. And so one of these kind of paradoxes is that, like metrical psalters, we think some of those editions are 3,000, for certain New Testaments up to 6,000, and those are often the books that have the incredibly high loss rates. These very, very commonly reprinted books where we're missing probably scores of editions, but that you have this kind of inverse proportion to the kind of quantity that were originally printed and the quantity that now survive.
So to paraphrase, the editions with many copies might be more likely to be lost.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a great bibliographer in the early 1940s named Oliver Willard, who came up with the sort of a maxim that I think is, like, it's one I always remember, which is that the fewer there are, the more there were, which is that editions that now survive in only a single copy or a couple of copies, you would normally say, oh, they probably weren't printed in the same numbers, when in fact the opposite is true. If a book was popular and it was printed a lot, you're going to have fewer surviving copies, where it's the works that, were just printed once, that weren't constantly being reprinted, that paradoxically have higher odds of surviving.
Just one addition. I'm going to get another question in, but one of the things we were talking about at lunch is in the same Willard article. He identifies this phenomenon where if you've got a book that gets reprinted a bunch, and then all of a sudden there's a final edition in the period where there aren't any more after it, so it kind of has a lifespan. That final edition tends to survive in a substantially higher number of copies than any of the earlier editions. It's like 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 12, 15. There's an example in the exhibition of this. And that suggests that there's something about, potentially, the kind of awareness that something goes out of print that changes the disposition toward the artifact. That like, oh, we're no more of them, maybe we should collect it now or something, where you have this kind of radical shift in the sort of survival rates that seems unexplainable by any other feature than some awareness that like there's scarcity and that one should try to preserve, but that it also seems to suggest that perhaps those copies, the earlier editions had already been gone, and so they were no longer salvageable, which makes a sort of inference about, there's a question online about how do we know when the books were lost? There's another question also about the English, the London fire of the 1660s, which is like, do you think, Alan, when do you think the books were lost? How might we gauge make any inferences about that? Is it that we're dealing with early loss, or maybe there's some, like all of a sudden in the 1720s, they're like, no more prose fiction, get it off my lawn?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's a great question, and it's one that's sort of hard to answer and interesting to think about. My own sense is, based on the kind of evidence that Aaron just mentioned, where the final surviving edition of a work that had been printed multiple times tends to survive in more copies than earlier ones, that a lot of this loss probably would have happened sort of earlier rather than later. And that obviously, if you think about Renaissance drama, the fact that by the 18th century, the plays of Shakespeare and his contemporaries were highly sought after at that point, that prevented future loss from happening. But by that time, I kind of feel like if a work was going to survive, it's not as if in the 18th century suddenly, readers were like, "Ah, screw these old books." I have a feeling it's more like now when we get rid of books, where you're like, "I am done with this. This is going in the little free library on the corner," and that it speaks more to sort of earlier generations. The books, that you own that. Then you die, and your kids don't want them. That I think it would happen earlier rather than later centuries being the time when it would tend to occur.
Let's take one more question from the audience here. What do you guys got for us? I want one, damn it. Hannah.
I'm interested in lost books that have been found. And so could you tell me, over the last 20 years, have any cool lost books turned up? And if so, where did they find them, and where should we look?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, which I will answer. I will give you an answer, and then Aaron will give you a more interesting answer. So for me, one of the outcomes of working on numbered editions was that when you know that, there's a missing 10th edition, that gives you something to look for. And so I was part of a collection that work appeared in. And it just so happened that it was being published by Yale University Press. And so they were going all in on producing a really high quality book with great images. And so they were looking for numbered editions in their collections. And it just so happened that not their main library, but their medical library had a copy of a prayer book that is not known in the STC. And so it's one of those missing numbered editions that it just wasn't in a central enough location that caused it to be sort of missed by people. And so that's a case of an edition that was lost that only I cared about was found. But what I think that testifies to is that you're unlikely to find many lost editions in major collections. Like, you're unlikely to find a lost edition here at the Ransom Center. It's going to be more of the out-of-the-way libraries. And then within that, one of the things that also happens is that Sammelbands, when they're cataloged by librarians, sometimes they'll only do the first title. So here at Ohio State, or not here, but where I work at Ohio State, they made a couple of acquisitions of kind of large collections in the early 2000s. And the current curator of rare books, Aaron Johnson, tells about, like, yeah, when I go into a Sammelband, I'll often find the first copy's been listed, and then there's 10 other works that haven't been. And so I suspect that you're going to find a lot of lost copies that are bound together in Sammelbands, but haven't been fully opened and looked at.
Yeah, I mean, the most commonly, the books you find new editions of are the ones you'd expect to find new editions of. And so it's like, yet another Sternhold and Hopkins metrical Psalter, yet another small format New Testament, yet another small BCP, so yet another Bailey's Practice of Piety, like the devotional book of the first half of, the entire 17th century, really. And so what you tend to find are exactly those kind of books that sort of follow the kind of Willard pattern, where you've got boatloads of editions, they survive in very low numbers of copies per edition, and also they're the kind of books that typically haven't actually migrated to institutional collections, because institutions don't care about who needs another Bailey, who needs yet another Sternhold and Hopkins. And when they do appear on the market and they do turn up, they're regularly, if not usually, in sexy bindings. And so I've got a section in the survival case in the exhibition where there are these three kind of books, in like, one's in an embroidered binding, one's in a dos-a-dos binding where they're kind of back to back, and one's in like a very small big book binding, but it's little. And so, those are books that survive in 1 or 2 copies, period, and that when they come on the market, it's because somebody kept it because it was embroidered, but nobody cared that it was like the unattested 24mo edition of Sternhold and Hopkins from 1613. That is pretty atypical, but it's when the stuff that shows up is exactly the stuff that we know is very popular, and it's incredibly atypical to find an actual extant copy of a text that we didn't know. It's very, very uncommon, except in the context of printed waste. And so the other place where things show up are fragments. And so, in the exhibition, there is a two-leaf fragment from the English literature people know this book called Toddle's Miscellany. It's one of the first anthologies of sort of semi-secular English verse. It's kind of complicated. But there's a predecessor to that survives in 3 fragments called the Court of Venus that has Sir Thomas Wyatt's poetry in it. And we have the only fragment of an entire edition of that. It's just 2 leaves from a copy that went to hell and that somebody's used it for end leaves. And medieval manuscript people know this very well, looking for manuscript bits as the only extant exemplars of certain texts, or at least certain instances. But it's very, very common to find unattested printed material in bindings, especially for the ephemeral stuff that Alan kind of bracketed. And so, like, apprentice indentures, there's some of those in the exhibition. You'll find, like, wall almanacs, the kind of stuff that just is completely off the radar. When that survives, it's almost never because of intentional preservation, and only because of recycling and accidental reuse. All right, we have a reception. I hope you all will join us. Let's thank Alan, who's a champion, and thank you all for coming.